My Brother Sam is Dead, Chapter 12. In June of that year, 1777, we found out that Father was dead. He had been dead for a month. It had happened pretty much as we guessed it. He'd been sent to a prison ship in New York. There was one funny thing about it, though. It wasn't a rebel prison ship, it was a British one. We never did figure out how that happened. It had just come out of the confusion of the war somehow. It didn't matter much. In the end, though, those prison ships were terrible places, filthy and baking hot in the summer and freezing in the winter. Of course, there was nothing but slop to eat. The worst part was the disease. If anybody got sick with anything serious, everybody on the ship was liable to get it. That's what happened to Father. They had an epidemic of cholera on the prison ship he'd been on. About 40 or 50 people had died from it, and he'd been one of them. They buried him someplace on Long Island, but we weren't sure where. Mother said, after the war, we'll find where he lives, or where he lies, and have some headstone made for him. But I don't think she believed that we'd be able to do that. We found all of this out from one of the men who'd been taken away during the raid on Reading that spring. He'd been put in the same ship, and he'd been with Father when he died. Before he died, he asked me to make sure that you knew what had happened. He said, "Tell them I love them," and said that forgive Sam. He was a brave boy, but he's headstrong. The last thing he said was, "And now I go to enjoy the freedom war has brought me." But Father wasn't the only one who died. 2 days later, we found out that about Father. Betsy Reed came down from the tavern. I gave her a pot of beer. "Did you hear about Jeremiah Stanford?" she said. "No, he's dead," I said. "Jerry? He's dead?" "Nobody understands it. They put him on a prison ship and he got sick and he died in 3 weeks. It doesn't make any sense. You can understand why they took Mr. Rogers or Captain Betts, but why in prison a 10-year-old boy? What harm could he have done to them? This war has turned the men into animals," Mom said. "They sunk his body in Long Island Sound in the weighted sack," Betsy said, "so his parents can't even get him back. I don't understand it. What did they want him for?" "They're animals now. They're all beasts," Mother said. "I think they are," Betsy said. "Sam should have come home." It was the first time I'd ever heard her say something against Sam and his ideals. I told him that, I said. He said he'd taken a pledge with some friends to stick it out until they won. "Does he still think they're going to win?" Betsy said. "Maybe they will," I said. Betsy shook her head. "Even Father said things are going badly for the Patriots." I look at her curiously. "Don't you want them to win?" "I don't care who wins anymore. I just want it to be over." "Sam wouldn't like to hear you talk like that." "I don't care," she said. "When I see him, I'm going to tell him. For 3 years they've been fighting, and all we've had is death and hunger. Your father's dead. Jerry Sanford is dead. Sam Barlow is dead. David Fairchild is dead. Stephen Fairchild is wounded, and more." Mother nodded. "Right at the beginning, life said it would be that way. He said, in war, the dead pay the debts for the living. But he didn't think that he would have to pay it for himself. So Father had forgiven Sam, and I think Mother did, although she never said so. But for myself, I wasn't so sure. I knew that I'd be glad to see him and have him at home, but still, I felt it was partly his fault that Father had died. Oh, he hadn't captured Father or thrown him in prison or given him cholera or anything like that. But he was fighting on the other side, and I couldn't easily forget about that. Yet, of course, it was a British prison ship he died on, and it seemed to me that everybody was to blame, and I decided that I wasn't going to be on anybody's side anymore. Neither of them was right. So summer passed, and it became winter once more, and people were suffering worse than ever from one. Luckily, there wasn't any more fighting around Reading. Anyway, in the winter, they didn't fight much. Nobody liked to fight in the cold, and when there was snow on the ground, it was hard to march and easy to get sick. The Continental Army was encamped at a place called Valley Forge, out in Pennsylvania somewhere. We didn't know whether Sam was there or not. From what we'd heard, they were practically starving and hadn't had any clothes. I was just glad. It made me hope that the rebels were at the end of their rope and they would give up pretty soon and end this terrible war. I didn't even mind that Sam might be suffering with cold and hunger. It serves him right. We were pretty hungry ourselves. Sam began writing us letters every once in a while, every 2 or 3 months, especially after he heard that Father was dead. He didn't tell us where he was in his letters. Mostly they'd been about places he'd been. Sometimes Betsy Reed would get a letter from him too, and she'd come down and tell us about it. So time passed. The year 1777 ended and 1778 began. Spring came, and then summer, and then fall. And we harvested. Oh, how I hated the war. All life was like running on a treadmill. I was 14. I should have been going to school all this while and learning something. Maybe this time I would have begun to think about going to New Haven to study at Yale. I wasn't much interested in Latin or Greek, but the last couple of years I'd learned a lot about buying and selling in the tavern business. I wanted to study calculating and surveying and the agricultural sciences. I thought I might have a career in business. I might apprentice myself to the merchant in New Haven or New York or even London to learn the art of the trade. Sam owed it to me to come home and help Mother and run the tavern for a couple of years while I started to make my way in the world. Until the war ended, there was nothing for me to do but to tread water. Prices kept spiraling upwards. Merchandise grew shorter and shorter in supply, and everybody seemed to be in debt. You couldn't refuse a hungry widow who had lost her husband in the war some cloth or molasses on credit, but then how would we pay for the new merchandise ourselves? We couldn't get over to Verplank's Point that fall. The rebels were holding all of the northern Westchester County, Peeksville, Verplank's compound, all of it. There was no way for us to get any cattle, though. There wasn't much cattle around anyway. Bit by bit, people began slaughtering their stock for food. However, Mother and I have been able to get a hold of 8 scrawny cows, mainly from people who owed us a lot of money. There wasn't much to them, but with food in such short supply, we figured we could get a pretty good price if we could get them to a British commissary somewhere. Not that I cared which side we sold them to. The British were the ones who had the money. They had the whole English choir behind them. The Continentals were paying off the commissary scrip, which could be totally worthless if they lost. I heard that there were a British commissary in the White Plains, which was about 25 miles southwest of the New York state line. I figured I might be able to drive the cattle down there through the woods. It would be very risky, but better than going hungry. We needed some money to buy goods and keep the tavern and store going. If the business died, we were really going to be out of luck. Hunger is a pretty terrible thing. It's like going around all day with a nail in your shoe. You try to put it out of your mind, but you never really quite forget it. And when something reminds you of it, like reading about a big meal in a story or seeing a stack of bread, it really hurts. I mean, it just plain hurts. It makes you feel weak, and you get sick easily too. That winter, everybody had colds and went around sniffling most of the time. Some people got really sick, and then their families would have to scrape up extra food to feed them with. Oh, I don't mean that people were dying from hunger. Nobody was actually starving to death, but most were hungry a lot of the time. All through November, I tried to find out about the British commissary, whether it really existed or not, and where it actually was, but I couldn't find out anything I really trusted. It was all rumors. The commissary was at White Plains. No, it wasn't. It was at White Plains. Yeah, it was at Horseneck. Yes, it was at White Plains after all. But the rebels had it under siege, and so forth. I didn't want to go until I was sure. If I ran into the rebels, I'd lose the cattle, and I'd probably be put in prison myself. It was only worth the risk if I were sure that if I knew where the commissary was. Otherwise, I might just as well eat the cattle ourselves. So that was the situation on December 3rd, 1778, when Sam came back to Reading. That morning, he walked into the tavern. He looked thin and tired. There were black circles under his eyes, and his uniform was torn in about 6 places. He lost his belt and was wearing some piece of rope around his waist. His hat wasn't an army hat, but just an ordinary fur cap. He was glad to be home and grinning. "Hello, everybody," he said. Mother was out in the kitchen, and I'd been stocking up the fire. "Sam!" I shouted. "Mother, Sam's here!" She burst in the tavern and began to hug him, and I began to hug him too. Then he crouched down in front of the fire and ate a bowl of porridge with honey that Mother brought him. "This is the first time that I've been warm in a week," he said. So we all asked him all the natural questions, where he had been, where he was going, and so forth. "I'm going to be in Reading for a while," he said. "General Putnam is bringing a couple regiments here for winter encampment. We're going up to Lonetown and hole up this until spring." "What's the idea of that?" "The rumor is that we're supposed to be situated to move either west to the Hudson or south to Long Island Sound in case of a British attack either place. Some say we're mainly here to watch over the magazines at Middleton. I don't know. Those are all rumors. But we're building huts, so I guess we'll be here for a while." "How'd you get off?" "I had a bit of luck. Colonel Parsons, Samuel Holden Parsons, that is, has moved into the Betts house. An adjutant came around and asked if any of us were from here or from this area, and I said I was. And Colonel Parsons brought me into the town this morning to show him around. Sam grinned. To the ladies mostly. I told him that there weren't any ladies in Reading except for my mother and my girl. He said they would do. So, Mother, you'd better put on your best dress. Mother smiled, but I don't think she thought it was very funny. You're so thin, Sam, she said. Are the troops all starving? Everybody in the country is hungry, he said. It's going to be worse this winter, too. Have you got any cattle, Tim? I was proud that he asked me instead of Mother. 8, I said. They're not much to look at. Butcher them and hide the meat, or sell it. You can get a good price for the hides from the troops. Sell what you can. I promise you the stock will be stolen. Mother frowned. You mean your troops are stealing from your own people? A starving man will steal food from babies. He shook his head. There's a lot you don't understand. All of us have seen good friends killed. I had a friend bayoneted, and it took him 6 hours to die, screaming all the while. All we could do for him was hold his hand and wait. I saw the captain I love blown in half by a cannonball. He was the best officer we ever had. He worried about his men, and he put them first. He never ate before we were fed. I've seen him go without to give his portion to a sick man. The redcoats blew him in half, right into 2 pieces, with his guts dangling out of both parts. He shivered. After a few things like that, you don't give a damn for anybody but your friends anymore. You kill redcoats and you butcher pigs. The troops know that Reading is a Tory town. As far as they're concerned, taking cattle from the Tories is getting revenge. Sure, lots of them would steal from anybody, whether they were Tories or Patriots or anything else. Some are unscrupulous when they're hungry, and some are unscrupulous by nature, and they take whatever they think they can get away with. Of course, a majority of the men aren't honest and won't steal, but if they decide you're Tories, they'll have no compunction about taking your beef. And let me tell you, it's pretty easy to decide somebody's a Tory when you haven't eaten anything but hardtack and pork fat for weeks. I've done it myself. Sam, I won't apologize. War turns men into animals, Mother said. I was ashamed of it afterwards, Sam said, but not very, and my belly was full. He nodded slowly. Tim, butcher the cattle. Let the meat freeze and hide it in the loft under the hay until you need it. He glanced out the window towards Bet's house. I better go. Colonel Parsons might be waiting for me. Don't go yet, Sam, Mother said. We've just seen you. I'll be around all winter, Mother. Maybe I can get attached to Colonel Parsons' staff. I'll try to get a pass if I can. Anyway, I can always slip out at night. It's risky. Colonel Parsons is not harsh, but General Putnam is in charge. He's a great patriot, and he's rough and tough and on men who shirk their duty. 100 lashes for desertion, and if there's too much of it, I know he'll hang some people as an example. That's the kind of man he is. But I'll go back and visit again, one way or another. He left. He walked out into the yard. We walked out into the yard with him, and he crossed over to the Betts house and went in. He's so thin, Mother said. I worry that he'll get sick. I couldn't bear to lose another, Tim. All at once she began to sob. It only lasted 10 seconds. Then she turned around and went into the house, and when I went in a minute later, she was calmly scrubbing some beets. After December 3rd, we began to get used to the sight of soldiers constantly around town. There were always messengers going by in trains of supplies wagons crunching over the snow, and sometimes groups of soldiers on work parties would appear at the tavern for beer. Having the troops around was good for business. Some of the officers lodged in the houses around about. Often in the evening they came up to the tavern to play cards and drink or smoke. Business was good, or rather, it would be good if we had anything to sell, but the people had to pay anything to pay for it with, besides commissary scrip. The biggest demand was liquor. Life at the end of encampment was cold and miserable, and the only relief for them was drinking. They didn't care what it was. Rum, whiskey, cider, anything we could get. Whiskey was pretty hard to get. The General Assembly had made it illegal to distill whiskey because it was made from grain, and grain was needed for food. Rum was easier to get, and we could usually get cider because every farmer made it. I spent a lot of time riding around the farmers, buying whatever they had. They often had rum they'd taken in trade for livestock. I could offer them good prices for liquor because we could get good prices for it. The officers didn't care how much they paid for liquor, as they said when they were drinking, a short life but a merry one. Which of them knew when he was going to die? Of course, the ordinary soldiers didn't have much fun. For one thing, there was always snow. It came down in a great blizzard about a week after the troops had started to build their encampment. Their huts were not finished, and they were forced to work in the bitter cold and storm. The cold was a problem. The huts were really just tiny log cabins with big stone fireplaces making the whole rear wall. In the cold weather, they had a lot of trouble getting the mortar to set. Because of this, the chimneys leaked so badly that half the smoke blew back into the room. The snow made hewing wood difficult too. Sam told us that they were having an awful time getting the huts finished. Even when they were done, they weren't much to live in. 12 soldiers jammed into a 14 by 16 room, breathing more smoke than air and having stumbled over people whenever they wanted to move around. And the snow never stopped falling. By January, it covered the countryside 3 feet deep so that the stone walls disappeared. You could drive a sled over the snow anywhere you wanted without paying attention to where the roads were. Sam was able to get into town every week or 10 days. Colonel Parsons used him as a messenger a lot because he knew his way around Reading. Sometimes he would come in with a commissary officer looking for lime or nails or leather or all the hundreds of things armies needed. The idea was that Sam might know who had things. Often he'd come into the tavern and he asked me if I knew who had hay or sleds or something else to sell. To be honest, I felt uneasy about telling him such things. The commissary people always paid for whatever they had bought, but it was usually in script. And on top of that, the farmer didn't have much choice about selling it or not. But I couldn't bring myself to lie to Sam. It was always something I had never done. All the time, Sam was after us to butcher the cattle. I didn't know what to do. The idea of selling them to the British was gone. With all the rebel troops around, it was too risky trying to move the cattle anywhere. Besides, it would have been next to impossible in the deep snow. Still, I kept hoping that I could find someone who'd offer me a good deal for them. But Sam was pressing me. I'm warning you, Tim. Sooner or later, somebody's going to get them. I thought General Putnam gave strict orders about stealing. Oh, he did, and knowing General Putnam, he'll hang any soldier he catches stealing. He's tough as nails, but he's honest. Besides, he wants people to come around to our side, and if he lets the troops forage, he'll lose the sympathy of all the populace. Oh, and I know him. He's had a lot of men flogged already for disobeying orders, and I'm sure he's just itching to catch somebody stealing so he can make an example of them. Then what's to worry? Don't be stupid, Tim. A lot of men will take the chance anyway, especially when they're drunk. You wait. Sooner or later, they'll get into your beef if you don't watch it. Mother and I kept turning it around between us. She figured Sam was right. You know what happened to Sally Miles' heifer? Miss Miles was a widow who lived alone in a tiny hovel in Reading. She had a few tough chickens and one scrawny cow. She kept going mostly by selling the milk and eggs to people around. A few days earlier, 6 drunken soldiers had noticed her cow in the barn, butchered it right there, and carried slabs of beef back to encampment in the dark. I know, I said, but the thing we need most is rum, and the only way to pay for it is with cattle. That was the beginning of January. We decided to stick it out through the month. There was a rumor going around that the British were forming up in New York and were going to raid towns in Long Island. What that meant nobody knew, but someone believed that the men from the encampment would be called down there to fight. I just couldn't make up my mind. The weeks went by. There was nothing anybody wanted but to get through this terrible winter. It didn't seem that the war could really last much longer. Even Sam thought it was going to come to an end soon. We talked about it one evening when he was there for a short visit. We were sitting in front of the taproom fire one night late in January. I think something decisive will happen in the spring, he said. The English government realizes now that they're not going to beat us easily. Maybe they figured you're too starved and too tired to fight much longer. He shook his head seriously. They might be right. He said, the other day some of the men were actually talking unity. A lot of them have no blankets. They're short on food, and the pay hasn't come through. A bunch of them decided to march to Hartford and demand their pay. They were about to start out when General Putnam rode up and talked them out of it. Then he had a couple of the ringleaders shot right there to show no mercy when he thinks he's right. Suddenly he stopped talking. "What's that? What was that?" I heard it too, a kind of thump, and then a cow bawling. We listened. There were noises coming out from somewhere. Sounds like someone's bothering the cattle," I said. "There are people out there," Sam shouted. "Let's go." We ran through the kitchen towards the barn. It was dark. There was nearly a full moon reflected on the snow and plenty of light around to see what was happening. The barn doors were open. 2 cows were standing in front of the barn blinking, and we could see 2 more behind. We dashed into the barn. 4 of the cows were gone. "Jesus, damn!" I shouted. "Pen 'em up," Sam shouted. "They'll be butchering the others somewhere near. There's no chance of driving them very far in this snow." He darted around the house towards the road, his eyes following the hoof prints in the snow. I snatched up the shovel, and I drove the remaining 4 cattle back into the barn with the handle. They were balking, and it took me a few minutes to get them inside with the door shut and latched. Then I raced across the snow around the house to the road. Then I stopped and swung my eyes across the horizon. I saw nothing, but distantly I heard the noise of shouting. Off towards the far end of the training ground, I ran in the direction of the sounds, and then suddenly I saw 3 men walking towards me through the moonlight, side by side. I stopped and I waited. They came up. The one in the middle was Sam. His nose was bleeding and there was a cut on his chin. His hands were tied behind his back. I stood in the open white field surrounded by the shadowy trees. "Sam!" I shouted. "Timmy, get Colonel Parsons," he cried. They're taking me in as a cattle thief." I went cold, and then I turned and I ran.